The main character's name is Reina. She is a surgeon and she has one secret. Then the girl proudly dedicated her life to helping others. But everything changed when she drowned. Reina has already woken up in a world where medical practice is stolen by death. But when the protagonist found him, Reina couldn't let him die. As it turned out, his name is Zared, and he is the captain of the Royal Guard. In exchange for saving his life, he took the girl to a safe house in the royal palace. And now the protagonist is disguised as a man. Not only does she have to keep her gender a secret, but also Reina has become the physician of His Highness Prince Damien himself. Prince Damien is cold and indifferent. He steadfastly refuses treatment, but they will see about that. There is one difference between the prince and his guard, that Reina is actually a girl. But Damien doesn't know that. But despite that, the protagonist is growing closer to them, not to mention being told to let the girl come to her senses. Because with her new allies, the protagonist is going to reform this backward world and give proper medical care to people who need it, as the prince's personal physician. At this time, Prince Damien is sitting at his desk reading papers. Suddenly, someone walks in and addresses His Highness. He is told that Zared requests an audience. He will also bring a guest. Then Prince Damien says, "Let them come in." At this point, Zared turns to His Highness and says that he has heard that Mr. Fraze's partner has fallen ill, and so Damien is here to offer a replacement doctor. At this point, Zared suggests the main character, who has already been reincarnated as a guy. The prince asks, "What noble lineage is this guy from?" Damien says that they ended up bringing a peasant to the prince. But Reina wasn't a noble guy or a peasant, since she's not even from this world. Not that Reina could tell them such things, but she didn't understand why she was the youngest surgeon in her department who graduated Harvard Medical School at the top of her class. Standing there with bandages on her chest in men's clothing, the downcast prince calls her a peasant. But this is a story the protagonist wants to start at the beginning. When Reina was working at the hospital, she got a call that there was a patient after a traffic accident, and there is a man in the emergency room here. He's 24 years old and was found drunk driving with blunt abdominal trauma. The patient is unstable and admitted to triage in a coma. Reina asked. If he's unstable, she suspects the guy has spleen damage, and they may have to do an emergency abdominal surgical incision. Reina says that's where she'll be. After some time in the operating room, the doctors talk about how stable this guy is. The main character didn't expect him to survive with those injuries. One nurse talks about how the rumors don't lie that the protagonist really does have golden hands. Reina talks about how the doctors are very kind and they couldn't have done all of this without them. One nurse talks about how they are planning to have a drink tonight. She asks the protagonist if Reina can come along with them, but the protagonist apologizes. She says that she has an information program tonight, so they should have fun without her. In the evening, the girl went to the bus and got a message from a guy named Kai. He asked where the girl was, where she was right now. But before that, he sent her a message and asked if Reina wanted to accept his proposal. He said Reina could marry him and take over the hospital. He asked if Reina didn't want to offer. But the girl did not respond to this message. Then Kai kept on asking, "Is Reina going to work in this tiny, pathetic hospital forever, not volunteering in the slums?" The guy said Reina is wasting her talent in nothing, and she's capable of so much more, and Kai can help her. He asked what else the girl wanted from the man. He was a doctor too. Reina started to get angry and said that this stupid guy really doesn't know how to take no for an answer, and Reina should reject him nicely. The girl wanted to say just so he won't text her anymore, but Reina decided that she's not that rude and she has manners after all. But after only one moment, the girl accidentally sent that message. That's when Reina started to get nervous, and she hoped that everything would be okay. This spoiled guy should at least take her hint now. Reina used to think Kai was harmless, rich, spoiled, and bossy, but harmless. They were classmates in medical school. At first, the guy left the girl alone until they got into the same residency. It wasn't until later that Reina found out that it was actually his father who owned the hospital. Reina thought he really couldn't take her rejection for an answer. But in reality, he still can't do that. But no matter how many times he asked a girl out, Reina would never agree to go with a guy like Kai. After a while, the girl is already walking down the road. She thinks about how hungry she is. She asks herself what she should cook tonight. She thinks of making spicy soup or tofu or maybe even seafood noodles. At that moment, it starts to rain. The girl tries to see something ahead, but suddenly a guy grabs her hand. She asks the guy, "What is he going to do in this place?" But the guy talks about what he asked the girl politely. This is the same guy Kai. Reina says her answer will remain the same, and she's told him that a million times. Kai talks about how he's serious. He asks, "Does Reina really want to spend the rest of her career with stupid people when Reina could be on top with him?" The main character asks to be allowed to just leave. Kai says it must be sad. After all, Reina comes home every day to an empty apartment to sleep in an empty bed. But Kai knows it's hard to be an orphan, but girls, they are bound to be alone forever. The girl gets angry and she slaps her hand on the guy's face. She wonders what Kai could possibly know about her. Just because he's the son of some important CEO doesn't give him the right to say whatever he wants. The right to say whatever he wants. And those stupid people they all mock are needy people, not that kind of spoiled boy. As Kai would understand how that feels. Offended and frustrated, the main character turns around and starts to walk away. Kai tries to stop her. He tells her to let Reina come back. He suggests the girl go at least under an umbrella, but Reina doesn't listen to him and she runs away. At this point, Reina finds herself a road that goes to the water. She walks onto the pier. Kai approaches the girl on Reina, step by step enters back. The girl does not see where she is going. Kai offers to talk it over, when both are drying off from the rain. Kai doesn't want the girl to get sick, but Reina says she has nothing to say to the guy. She asks that Kai should just leave her alone. At this point, the girl gets very close to the water with her foot. She steps back and starts to fall. It's quite deep in there. Kai tries to catch the girl, but Reina plunges into the water. After some time, Reina wakes up. When the girl opened her eyes, she started getting angry at the guy and talking about how he is impudent and spoiled. When the protagonist got up, she could not understand what place she got into. But that's when she noticed 2 moons in the sky. The protagonist gets scared and she doesn't realize where she is. She wonders if she fell off the pier. She hopes it's still Earth. The girl walks through the woods trying to find a living soul. She thinks it must be a dream. And now she's probably being treated in a hospital. But Reina doesn't understand why, then she feels hungry in her sleep. Suddenly, the girl trips over something and starts to fall. There sits a very injured guy under a tree. Reina asks, "Is everything okay with the guy?" She doesn't understand what happened to him. The girl tries to help him. Reina says the guy has a frequent heartbeat that is above normal, but the guy's blood oxygen saturation is fine. Reina wants to watch his wound and wash it. Reina asks why she's even talking to this man if he's unconscious. The main character tries to pick the guy up and put him on the ground. She sees that he has a very large wound. The girl thinks about the fact that she's going to have to stitch it up since it's a pretty deep wound. She doesn't understand what this guy could have cut himself so badly, but at least the guy's lucky she's got all the essentials with her. The girl has a flashlight in her mouth and is trying to shine it on herself to see what she's doing. At this point, the girl stitches up the guy's wound and tells him that everything is ready, and that should be enough for now. Thinks about how she's really tired and she thinks she should stay with this guy to make sure he's okay. After some time, the protagonist fell asleep and the guy already opened his eyes. The guy doesn't understand. Did the woman really heal him? He sees that the girl is sound asleep and she must be exhausted. At that moment, the guy lifts the girl in his arms. The guy starts to carry the girl, and suddenly he sees that there is a horse standing there. In his arms with the main character, gets on the horse and they start to ride. He decides to take the girl to the safe place. In the morning, the protagonist has already opened her eyes. She is lying on the bed and does not understand what is happening. The guy wishes the protagonist good morning and he calls her his savior. But he asks if it might be better to say that the girl is a witch. Reina doesn't understand what the guy's talking about. She asks where she is and what this place is. She doesn't understand why the guy brought her to this place. She asks who he is. Guy replies that he should ask the girl the same thing. He asks why she was in the woods so far from the capital. Not to mention it was in the middle of the night. Reina says that's what she's lost about. The guy asks where the girl is from. After all, there is no village near where they were. Reina tells him that she is somewhere far away from that place, and she doesn't really know how she can get back to her home. The boy thinks about how he's never seen clothes like this before, or even he's never seen one of her country tools in a bag before. but it looks like the girl is telling the truth. The guy talks about how he regrets it. But regardless of where she's from, the girl saved his life, and for that he's incredibly grateful to her. Reina says it's not her problem, and her job is helping people and she's a doctor. The guy says that, and Reina shouldn't talk about it so freely. He asks if she doesn't know she could be accused of witchcraft. Reina is incredibly surprised at being called a witch. The protagonist asks why she has to be a witch. It's not like she was traveling and stumbled into the medieval period or anything. Reina is incredibly surprised. She asks, has she stumbled into one of those weird Ren isekai? The guy talks about how he knows it might sound weird, but the girl isn't from here and he means it. She could have been executed as a witch, and he's seen this kind of thing before. And Reina asks how there could be an execution because she's a doctor. But the guy says it's not because she's a doctor, it's because she's a female doctor, and especially with her powers. The guy offers to help the girl find her way back to her house. Reina thanks the guy, but she thinks it's impossible. The guy understands her. He suggests that she listen to his offer. He doesn't know if she's really a witch or not, but he can protect her. He starts by asking her what her name is. Reina says she's not a doctor and her name is Reina. The guy says the girl can trust him. After all, she saved his life, which means he will save hers. At this point, the guy picks up some bandages and scissors. Reina asks what it's for. But the guy doesn't say anything and puts a bowl on the girl's head. Reina says, that guy can save her life, but she doesn't want him to approach her with scissors. The guy tells Reina to trust him since she needs a disguise, and he's also good at cutting hair. That's not what he promises. After a while, the girl looks in the mirror and her hair is cut short. She asks, did the guy just bring her here to mess with her? But the guy says he didn't, and it's just a haircut. It's also pretty popular. The guy hands the girl bandages to wrap around her breasts, so the girl can wear the clothes he wore when he was younger. The guy says that when Reina is ready then, no go. The main character asks where they should go. After all, she doesn't even know the guy's name. The guy says the girl needs a new name as well. He asks how about calling her Ren. At this point, the guy says his name is Zared. He is a captain of the Royal Guard. Also, the guy is going to take the girl to the only place that will be safe. That's how the protagonist ended up in this place. The prince says it's good that Master Faraz is here too, and maybe he can appreciate this boy's skills. Faraz agrees with His Highness's words. At this point, Zared asks to be heard. At this point, the boy takes off his shirt and asks for permission to show the doctor's work. At this point, the boy shows his stitch on his body. Zared says that this boy saved his life. Damien asks if this boy attended a medical university founded by the church. Zared asks the main character if he attended the university. Reina replies that she didn't, but she's already a licensed surgeon in her world. The prince asks what makes the captain think this guy has the ability to become a palace doctor. The prince asks what if this guy can't do anything but carefully stitch up wounds. Reina realizes that's fine and places she'll be a doctor for the farmers. They can grow their own food. Damien talks about how he's confident in this guy's talent. His Highness talks about how if Damien wasn't his friend, he would have thrown him out of this room a long time ago. At this point, the prince turns to the master and asks what Master Faraz thinks about this. The master replies that even if Sir Damien vouches for him, he sees no redeeming qualities. Suddenly, someone knocks on the cabinet. A man comes in and he is sorry to interrupt His Majesty, but he says that Master Faraz is urgently needed in the infirmary. For Ralph's son, Urgis, is in terrible pain, and he is told that his condition is getting worse every day. The boy apologizes for distracting His Highness, but Damien says that the man is free. At this moment, Reina is thinking that it's bad if the guy's condition is worsening right now. Suddenly, the protagonist turns to His Highness and asks if she can go to the infirmary. After all, she is worried about the child's condition. After thinking for a bit, the prince agrees and says that Ren can go and see. After a while, Reina walks into the room where the kid is lying and the master is trying to help him. Urges has vomited painfully often at least 4 times. He also has a fever and lost his appetite. The wallpaper in his stomach has suddenly moved. The pain is now on his lower right side whenever he moves. Master Faraz speaks of having seen many similar cases like this. He feels sorry for a man named Ralph. The master says that even with the help of their medicines, they won't be able to help him, and the foreman is afraid this guy won't live to see tomorrow. Ralph starts to cry. because he knew that even with the high priest's inventions, it still wouldn't be enough. But he'll do anything to save his son. He'll do anything. The protagonist gets tears in her eyes, and she remembers how in her life a father cried over his child. At this point, the protagonist talks about the boy needing emergency surgery, and she is ready to save his life. Reina thinks about the fact that drawing attention to herself is very risky, but she can't stand by when someone needs help. She goes to Mister and tells him that if he can really give anything to save his son. The girl asks him to let her do it. After all, it is a simple operation and she has done it over 100 times. At this point, Master Faraz tells Ralph not to listen to this guy. After all, he is a commoner with no medical training. This guy has no idea what he is saying. At this point, Ralph asks, "Will the guy really be able to save his son?" Reina says it's a simple procedure. Ralph replies that then the guy has his permission, and if there is even the slightest chance, then they have nothing left to lose. At this point, Reina thanks the man. After a while, the protagonist approaches the guy, who is very sick. The girl apologizes and says that she will do some physical tests. The guy doesn't understand what the doctor is telling him, but at that moment, the protagonist tries to understand with her hand what hurts the guy. The girl then concludes that the guy has acute appendicitis. At this point, Reina says that the kid needs emergency surgery before it's too late, and she can do the surgery right now. The man tells the doctor to do whatever it takes just to save his son. Master Faraz asks, how can Ralph leave his son in the hands of this inexperienced boy? After all, he could be a butcher. Ralph asks, does the master have any better ideas? After all, his son is dying on this bed. And Faraz said so himself. Faraz gets angry, he turns around and leaves. He says Ralph can do what he wants, but he must remember that Ralph himself asked for it. Master Faraz turns around and addresses the protagonist. He says that if the child dies on the operating table, he will order his heresy. At this point, Zared approaches the protagonist and says that he knows she can do it. That's why he wants the protagonist to take it easy. Reina has no idea what she's gotten herself into, but she's going to save this guy no matter what. After 3 days, the protagonist sits on her bed and thinks about how she wonders how Ira is doing now. After all, she can't even leave the room to check on him since she's still under house arrest. Reina thinks about how everything happened really fast. She thinks back to how their operation started. The girl was lucky that Ralph had some surgical experience and he was able to help her. And it turns out there are even primitive anesthetics and antiseptics in this world, which Reina had seen in museums before. Fortunately, the operation went smoothly, but without modern instruments and protective equipment, there's no guarantee that the child will recover. And Reina can only hope and pray that he's okay. The girl realizes she shouldn't be so picky, but the porridge the servants brought was terrible. At that moment, someone starts knocking on the girl's door, turns out to be Zared. Reina says the guy can come in. Zared talks about how it must be boring for the girls to be cooped up here alone. He asks the prince if she could go out a little bit, but the prince says it can be done on the condition that Zared keeps her company. Zared asks the girl if that would be okay. The protagonist agrees and offers to go to the infirmary together. After a while, they reach the infirmary and are met there by Master Faraz. Faraz asks the protagonist what makes her think she will be able to prove herself. Reina replies that she just wants to check how Ira is feeling right now. Reina asks, is everything okay with the boyfriend? But Da doesn't answer that it's none of the guy's business. He tells the guy to get out of this place immediately or he will throw him out of here himself. At this point, Master Faraz is approached and talks about the patient. Faraz says he'll be right over. Zared and the protagonist turn around and leave. At this point, Master Faraz checks on the woman's health. At this point, a little girl grabs the master's hand and thanks him for making her mom healthy again. Master Faraz talks about how it is his duty. At this time, the protagonist asks the captain if it is true that Faraz is a good doctor to his patients. Zared tells her that even though Faraz was unfair to the protagonist, but the master really cares about his patients, and he never refuses those who need help. At this point, Zared suggests the girl to cook something tastier than oatmeal. After some time, the protagonist and Zared are in the garden. They are sitting under a tree. The protagonist asks, is Zared really the captain of the Royal Guard? She asks, how did the guy get injured then? Zared replies that it confuses him a bit, but when he was returning from a patrol, He was ambushed by bandits. Reina realizes that sounds like a dangerous job. But at least Zared has recovered. But at that moment, the protagonist thinks about the guy Urges she's treating. Zared asks why he shouldn't give the protagonist a tour of the palace. After all, he still needs to visit the armory and the stables. The protagonist agrees. After a while, they find themselves in the armory. Zared is holding a sword. The protagonist says that the sword looks very heavy. Zared suggests that the girl try to support it. Reina picked up the sword and she can barely hold it with her 2 hands. Zared starts laughing and he decides to show the girl how to hold the sword properly. Reina thinks her hands are more suited for smaller objects. Zared says that's probably true, but the girl's hands are still talented. He offers to look at the local stables as well. At this time, the main character's boyfriend is already in the stables. Reina is grateful that Zared came for her. After all, he is very kind, and the girl is glad that she now has such a friend. Suddenly, Reina notices that the prince is sitting under a tree in the distance. He is asleep. The protagonist is surprised because it seems that the prince has a lot of free time. Zared says there's more to see, things to see. He suggests the girl go. Suddenly, Captain Zared begins to hear someone calling. It's the wars. Zared asks what it means. They tell him that by royal decree. They were ordered to escort Mr. Wren to Lazarus immediately. After all, Urgis's condition has changed. They want the protagonist to go along with them. After a while, they are already entering the palace. The protagonist cannot understand what happened to the guy. She hopes that it's nothing serious. At that moment, His Highness is approached by the guy who escorted the protagonist out and says, "They brought Mr. Wren as His Highness had ordered." His Highness thanks the guys and says that he can go. Reina doesn't understand what's going on. She asks if she can find out about the guy's condition. She asks what's wrong with him. But at this point, Urgis turns out to be very cheerful. He greets the protagonist and says that he is fine. Reina approaches the guy and talks about how he thought something bad happened. Wren is glad the guy is okay. Urgis says he's fine and his dad must have overdone the urgency. Ralph talks about how Urgis finally regained consciousness today after days of regaining consciousness and losing it again. Father wanted to inform His Highness. At this point, Reina turns to the boy and asks if she can look at his wound. Reina offers to let her see if it is healing well. Urgis agrees. After examining it, the protagonist says that the wound is healing very well. At this point, Master Faraz speaks angrily about it, unsurprisingly. The father asks the master, "Didn't he see the appendix taken out? After all, it is a revolutionary procedure." He asks who knew that this appendix could ruin so many patients. The prince asks if that's what the medical academy teaches. The master says not that he knew about it. But Ralph tells His Highness that he is sure no one has ever studied this kind of thing before. He turns to the protagonist and says that he dares to ask if Wren will agree to share her surgical technique because Ralph thinks that this information needs to be shared with the entire medical community. Wren replies that it's not really her technique, but her late master's. The protagonist thinks that's a good excuse, and she certainly can't attribute it to herself. The prince asks, "Was it really Wren who learned from the master and nowhere else?" Wren tells His Highness that he is sorry, but the master wished to remain anonymous after his death. Ralph asks if the girl thinks that the master was kind enough to pass the technique on to him. Wren replies that of course he does, and he thinks that the master would be pleased to know that his knowledge has spread, as long as his name is not given to the technique. Mentally, the girl thanks Dr. Charles McBarry for creating the incision for the appendectomy. At this point, the prince turns to Mr. Ralph and he asks, "Does his opinion mean that their palace physician Master Faraz is incompetent compared to this commoner?" Ralph begins to apologize to His Highness, but he didn't mean to belittle Faraz's abilities at all. The prince turns to the Danish master talking about his work in the palace. For years now, he asks, "Doesn't Faraz know anything about appendicitis?" The prince has praised the master in the past, but now his knowledge won't even compete with that of a healer from the village. He asks, perhaps he should replace the master with this guy. Reina is watching all this, and she realizes that this is definitely not what she wanted. Master Faraz appeals to His Highness and asks the prince to come to his senses. After all, the boy's late teacher is clearly an unusual man, and such knowledge is not even available in the capital. Not only does he lack these skills, but so does everyone else. The prince says that the master has many faults, and he is not the kind of man to tolerate incompetence. The royal healer is responsible for the well-being of everyone in the palace, and the prince can't trust their lives into untenable hands. Reina thinks about the fact that she doesn't know if she can intervene, but Master Faraz doesn't deserve to be treated this way. She remembers how the master helped a woman he was thanked by a small also. The master was very kind to this girl. Reina decides to go to His Highness and apologize because she thinks Master Faraz is a great doctor in his own right. He may not have known the technique that saved Ira, but that doesn't diminish his competence in other areas. Suddenly, Zared intervenes in the conversation and addresses His Highness and says that he agrees with what Ren said. After all, perhaps instead of replacing the royal physician, the prince could make Ren his personal physician. Reina enters puzzled. She realizes this is a bad idea, but she can't understand why Zared chooses this for her. After all, she thought Zared was her friend too. But Zared gestures for Reina not to worry because it's the perfect plan. Zared says that maybe with Ren's knowledge, he can cure the prince of the mysterious illness that has been plaguing him for the past few months. Reina can't understand what the captain is talking about. The prince replies that the captain is talking nonsense. But still, sometimes there is a thought in his words. Zared says that he is trying his best. At this point, the prince agrees. Suddenly, Master Faraz approaches His Highness and says that he is grateful that the prince has turned a blind eye to his incompetence, and the master promises that it won't happen again. At this point, the prince turns around and walks away. Reina doesn't understand. Is that really all the prince said? She doesn't realize who she is. After all, until now, the girl does not know how she ended up in this world. She wonders to herself if she might become the prince's personal physician. Master Faraz is getting angry. He doesn't know who he thinks he is, that boy. When the protagonist and Zared were walking down the corridor, they are approached by a boy who apologizes about Mr. Ren, but he was told to inform the doctor about his new place of residence. Reina couldn't understand, she asks. What new place of residence? The protagonist is asked to investigate after the guy in her rest. Since she didn't bring any clothes and things with her, they have prepared some outfits for her in the closet, and also her bag is already moved too. The boy says that His Highness mentioned that the physician was appointed as his personal physician, so they decided that the room next to His Highness's chambers would be best for her. When the doors to the protagonist's new quarters opened, Reina couldn't believe where she was. At that moment, Zared turns to Ren and tells her that he's on his way out, and the boy can get some rest. At this point, the servant hopes the doctor's rest will come to his liking. He says Mr. Ren can call him if he needs any help. Reina thinks about how she has never had such a large, luxurious room before. Suddenly, she notices some kind of strange door. Reina decides to walk towards it, but suddenly she notices that the prince is in there and he is in the process of changing his clothes. At that moment, Reina sharply closes the door. She doesn't realize. Is this really reality? Reina doesn't realize. Does she have to open the door again to find out? But at that moment, the prince says he didn't call the doctor. Reina apologizes. She says she didn't know their rooms were next door. Suddenly, the prince tells Reina to open the door. The prince says there is no need to shout through the door. He asks, "Does he really look that intimidating?" But Reina says His Highness doesn't look intimidating, and he sees a shirtless man in the mirror every day. At this point, the prince starts laughing. After a moment, the prince says he'll call a doctor when he needs one, and Ren doesn't need to shake him like a bird over her eggs, and the symptoms aren't severe yet. Ren says if he needs anything, he can call him, but the prince replies that he doesn't have time to examine him. At this point, the prince turns away. Reina thinks that this prince is upright and man is he in pain, but he doesn't accept help, and Reina turns to His Highness and talks about the fact that since he is a prince, their subjects are counting on him as a leader, and a prince can't be a good leader if he is in poor health. At this point, the prince turns and says that Ren is free to go. Ren apologizes for being too direct, but a doctor has to be honest with his patients and himself. The prince agrees and talks about that he will go for an examination as soon as he has time, and now the doctor can go. The protagonist agrees with the prince and closes the doors. When Reina closed the doors, she threw herself on her bed. She doesn't realize what a stubborn prince. After some time, the protagonist went out to the garden for a walk, and suddenly, she noticed a woman. She turned to her and asked for forgiveness, but at that moment the girl was frightened and dropped the book she was holding in her hands. Reina picked up the girl's book and apologized because she didn't mean to scare her. At that moment, when the protagonist took the book in her hands, she saw that it was a love book. But suddenly the girl snatched the book from the protagonist's hands. At this moment, Ren turns around and talks about what he wanted to say, that the girl's cat is very cute. Unexpectedly, the girl suggests that the protagonist should be friends from now on. The next morning, Reina wakes up and starts yelling that she has a scheduled surgery. In an hour, she asks where her hala is. But suddenly she realizes that she is no longer in her world. She asks, "Has it really only been a few days?" The girl doesn't understand how she's supposed to return to her home world, and if she has to live here for the rest of her life. She begins to feel angry that she will never find her way home. But for now, she will make the best of the situation, because there are still those who need her help. Suddenly, someone knocks on the main character's room. It turns out to be the same blonde-haired girl whom the protagonist met yesterday in the garden. The girl asks if Ren is up yet. When the protagonist hears the girl's voice suddenly, she starts to get ready to change into a man. She asked the girl to wait for a few seconds. When the protagonist came out, she was already changed. She asked what the girl needed. The girl said that she knows the doctor has a bad relationship with her older brother, so she can help him. At this point, the girl grabs Reina's hand and starts pulling her along. Reina asks the girl who is her older brother. After a while, they get to a room, and the girl closes the doors, and there stands the prince. Reina doesn't understand. Is it really her elder brother? It's the prince. But a girl named Vanya is the complete opposite of her brother. The protagonist doesn't understand how a cold man can have a benevolent sister. At this point, Vanya starts screaming and asking her brother why he hasn't been examined by Mr. Ren yet. She asks, doesn't he need to be examined until the pain gets worse? At this point, the prince is grateful for his sister's concern, but he doesn't have time for that right now. Vanya yells for the prince to make time for it. At this point, the prince turns to the protagonist to ask if Ren has received the medical devices that he ordered for him. Ren replies that he has. All that is needed, he thanks His Highness. They are just in his room and he will take them now and come back. As the protagonist closed the doors to the prince's room, suddenly Zared appears in front of her. Zared apologizes for getting in the girl's way. Reina also apologizes because she didn't know that Zared was standing behind the doors. Talks about how she'll be right back. At this point, the captain walks into the prince's room and His Highness asks, "Is something wrong?" The princess greets the captain. The captain apologizes for interrupting, but he says that a meeting with the townsfolk is about to begin. The prince turns to his sister and talks about how he already has to go. But the princess tries to hold her brother back and talks about how Damien can't do that. The prince turns to his sister and talks about how this is about the safety of their capital and he needs to go. Vanya tries to stop her brother, but she fails miserably. She begs for Ren to examine her clueless brother. The prince asks who the sister called stupid. But at this point, Damien agrees and tells Ren to do it as soon as possible. The prince takes off his shirt and he lies down on his bed for the doctor to examine him. Reina asks if she can find out from His Highness where his pain is. At this point, the prince points to the right side of his stomach and talks about that after eating, he experiences pain in that place. However, such cases are rare. Reina makes an examination and realizes that there is nothing wrong with the prince's heart or lungs, but the pain is only in the upper right area. Unexpectedly, the prince asks if the doctor has finished his examination. The protagonist turns to His Highness and talks about what she still needs to ask the prince a few questions and feel his abdomen to truly assess his condition. But the prince rises from his seat and he says he has many important things to do. The sister tries to stop her brother, but Damien talks about how he will call the doctor when he needs him. And right now, people need him. Prince turns around and leaves at this point. Zared apologizes to the protagonist prince, and Zared turn around and leave. Vanya turns to Ren, and she's really sorry about her brother's behavior, but Damien never took care of his health, and the princess thought it was the perfect opportunity to give him a thorough checkup, but he's always busy. Ren says it's fine and the princess doesn't need to apologize for her big brother. After all, he's just glad he was able to give him a little checkup. The princess is glad, but hopefully they'll get more opportunities like this. Vanya talks about how her brother is a real workaholic. Wanya suggests the protagonist check on the prince in the evening to see if he's sleeping well, and then Ren can say that it was the princess who gave that order. Reina realizes that if the prince's illness is what she thinks it is, then they need to act as soon as possible. Reina walks around the castle and she starts to get angry. The girl says it's driving her crazy. She doesn't understand how she can find someone in this huge castle if she gets lost every 5 minutes. After all, the girl lost her cell phone, and she's surrounded by unfamiliar faces, and her only patient here almost won't let her near him. Reina remembers the night she went to His Highness and told him that Princess Vanya was worried about his health. Reina asked for the prince to get some rest. Seeing the prince like that, the protagonist remembers herself when she was in medical school and practiced all night long. But back then, she had no one to look after her, and the prince doesn't know how lucky he is to have people who care about him, and the least she can do is make sure the prince doesn't work himself to death. Reina talks about how she's gonna need better tools and equipment. Suddenly, the protagonist notices that the knights are now jousting on swords. The girl thinks about the fact that she needs to find weapons. Reina thinks that Masha is too busy to accompany her. Reina sees that Zared is busy there as well. She realizes that the guy has clearly defined rectus abdominis and oblique abdominal muscles. Zared and Damien look quite healthy at first glance, but this proves that they can never know the patient's health without examining him. At this moment, Reina is observing the guy. Zared turns his attention to the girl, and at this moment the captain asks if he is all right. Zared puts his weapon away and tells the knights to practice what he told them with their peers. At this time, the captain approaches the protagonist, asking if the girl needs help. Ren apologizes for interrupting the guy's training. He just wanted to know if there was a forge in the palace, so he could make surgical instruments. Zared agrees to accompany the protagonist because he knows the blacksmith well. After a while, they arrive at their destination. Zared knocks on the door and asks if James is here. At that moment, the blacksmith opens the door and greets Zared. He apologizes for the smoke coming from his forge. After all, they came in while he was baking. Reina doesn't understand. Does this blacksmith really dog the swords? The blacksmith sees that new face is in front of him. He asks what the main character's name is. Reina introduces herself and says her name is Ren. The blacksmith says it's wonderful since he just baked some muffins and he can't say they're as good as his swords. Reina walks into his forge and she is incredibly surprised. She wonders if the blacksmith can make medical devices. At that moment, the blacksmith takes his muffins and talks about how maybe he left them on too long, and they're a little burnt. He suggests that the guests take some, but Zared and Reina refuse. The blacksmith gets incredibly upset and Reina decides just to taste what they taste like. Zared asks if Ren is sure, but Reina realizes it's nothing. After all, Zared didn't see the main character cook when she first started school. When Reina tries it, she says that it's actually quite delicious. The blacksmith is incredibly happy that the guy liked it since he used his secret ingredient. Reina doesn't understand. Could it really be soot? But the blacksmith says that they probably want something from him anyway. Ren talks about how he was recently appointed as the prince's personal physician and he needs surgical tools. Reina says that the blacksmith is very good at making weapons. The protagonist asks if she can hope that the blacksmith could make some tools for her. The blacksmith says he's pleased that Reina thinks so highly of him, but creating medical tools, it's not his specialty. The blacksmith says that Ren can't trust him with such important tools. There are also many talented artisans in the capital who would do it better than him. At this point, Zared tells the blacksmith to be more confident. After all, he hasn't even seen the tools the doctor needs yet. Zared asks if Ren could draw the tools he needs so James can take a look. The protagonist walks over to the table and she sees that there are goose quills. She doesn't understand how to even use it, but she realizes that it's a good thing that the surgical instruments have already become an extension of her hand. Reina never thought that the day would come when she would be responsible for making her own instruments. Zared can tell they look a lot simpler than the swords Kuznetsov made. At this point, Reina shows a drawing of her tools. The blacksmith says that maybe the captain is right, and he thought these surgical items would look like amputation saws, but the blacksmith is happy to say that he can lend the doctor some of his talent. The blacksmith talks about how he will do his best. The protagonist thanks the blacksmith, but she thinks about the fact that now she has to gather the medicine she needs and somehow get personal protective equipment. Zared thinks that Reina has settled in well, but she doesn't know what she will have to face. After some time, the protagonist and Zared come to see the manager of the royal pharmacy. They go into his office and he greets Captain Zared incredibly. He asks what Zared is sick with today. At this point, Zared approaches the manager, whose name is Albie, and Zared asks that Albie refrain from making such jokes in front of the new guy. Albie sees that this guy must be the prince's new personal physician, Mr. Wren. Albie talks about that he's the manager of the royal pharmacy ready for the guy's services. He asks that Wren call him by his first name, Anna. Wren says it's a pleasure to meet him, and he tells Albie to call him by his first name, Wren. Albie asks, "How did Dr. Wren get here?" The protagonist replies that since he is new to the palace, it would be good for him to familiarize himself with the medicines here. Albie tells him they have just about everything: cilantro, wormwood, mint, bitters, myrrh. Albie says that if Wren is talking about the newest and most expensive drug, it's the latest medical invention of the High Priest. At this point, Albie pulls out a small chest and says that it has miraculous healing powers and has greatly reduced the death rate among their knights. It is called penicillin. Reina asks, "How does it work?" But Albie says he has no idea because he's just a salesman. But what Reina wants to know has to do with curious witch gossip. Reina remembers that Zared also mentioned the witch. At this point, Zared asks that Albie tell them more specifically. Anna says it's just a rumor from 50 years ago. It's gossip too small to discuss. Wren talks about how he comes from a distant village and he has never heard of this witch. Anna agrees to tell this greatest gossip of the century. Albie would be ignorant not to enlighten this guy. Albie is willing to tell in brief that the witch was a legendary doctor with marvelous healing powers, who cared for everyone and asked for nothing in return. She was beloved by many, but the church condemned her as a heresy and a witch. The knowledge she possessed was too great. Reina asks, "Was it then that all women doctors were condemned as heresy?" She asked, "What happened to the witch?" Albie replies that unfortunately the witch has disappeared. Reina asks, "Did the church kill her?" But she doesn't know that. He asks what Reina thinks. Suddenly, Master Faraz walks in on them. Albie greets Master Danny and asks how he can help him. Faraz tells him that he has a patient with a frozen pus inflammation in his leg. He asks that Albie prepare ingredients for him. For a topical ointment, there should be wine, onions, and ox stings. Reina thinks about what she has heard of this ointment before. It was used for diseases in the Middle Ages, and recently research has shown that it actually has some antibacterial properties. But purulent inflammations can't be treated with antibiotics alone, because if it's not drained properly, the pus will continue to grow until it bursts, and then the infection becomes more serious. At this point, Reina goes to the master and asks if the pus has already been removed. But Faraz replies that it's not the guy's concern. Reina says that if the pus is congealed and won't drain on its own, then the master should open it up and dry it. Reina asks if Master Faraz understood the nature of the inflammation, because if the master doesn't dry it, the pus will burst, causing the wound to worsen. And after removing the pus covering the wound, the patient should also be treated with penicillin. To avoid further complications, Faraz asks, "Does the guy dare to tell him how to treat his patient?" Rain turns to the master and says that he didn't mean to insult him, but the master should keep in mind that he is giving him advice based only on his experience, and Reina trusts that he, fellow doctor, will understand him. But at this point, Faraz starts to get angry and talks about how Ren is insolent. Zared tries to stop the master and asks him to think over his words. After all, insulting their highness's personal physician. It is an insult to himself. At this time, Albie has already prepared what Master Faraz asked him to prepare. At this point, Faraz asks that Albie put penicillin with him as well. Faraz takes what he needs. He turns around and leaves. Reina thinks about how the foreman seems to be thinking her words. Reina thanks the pharmacy manager for his time because of the information. Albie says that Ren can stop by any time as he passes by. After a while, the protagonist and Zared walk down the hallway. She thanks the captain for always supporting her, but Zared replies that it's no problem because he is somewhat responsible for the situation the girl is in. He was intrigued, and Reina asks why Zared decided to help her. She doesn't understand, why Zared brought her to this place, because if women doctors are seen as heresy. She asks if Zared won't get punished for hiding her. Zared agrees to explain. To the girl, because ever since the witches disappeared, medicine has been on the wane. All women doctors have come to be considered heresy and unworthy of their knowledge, and those living in the Nishtaten could afford more of the church's medical expenses. These were and still are hard times. It's the reason the city guard demanded a meeting with the prince to discuss the citizens' problems, at least the most pressing of them. Zared talks about how he was born an ordinary man, not in a noble family, and meeting the protagonist gave him hope that somewhere in the distance, the knowledge of medicine continues beyond the church. Zared knows it was wrong of him to take it up with Ren, but Zared is hopeful that Ren can bring her incredible knowledge to the people of this kingdom, and he sees a small change that Reina has already had a hand in. Zared talks about having selfish thoughts as well. There's always a strained relationship between the church and the regular family, and neither of them wants to upset the delicate balance. But Damien is different. He is a prince to the people. Also, Damien is best friends with Captain Zared brought the girl to the castle since he believes that if anyone could heal him, it would only be Reina. Zared asks if Reina can forgive him for the burden he called on her. But Reina replies that it's not a burden that Zared has placed on her, and it's none other than the oath she took when she became a doctor. And Reina will never let anyone's life go to waste. From what Reina had seen, Reina concluded that people in this world had no idea about microbial theory. But that doesn't matter without the proper equipment, because every surgical procedure, with a high risk of complications and infection, the protagonist hopes that when working with the prince will not be a problem considering that he is quite stubborn. At that moment, a servant appears on the girl's way, saying that His Highness Prince Damien can receive the doctor now. Reina arrives at the prince's office. Damien asks, "Is there something Reina needs?" His Highness and apologizes, for he has a request for the prince. He asks if the prince can find him a tailor to make him a medical uniform. The prince asks if Reina has been to the palace tailor. Reina replies that he has, but the tailor's tailoring is not up to par. The prince asks, "What kind of medical uniform is so difficult to make?" He asks, "Does one have to wear special clothes during surgery?" Reina says that it is, after all. Surgical uniforms worn by doctors protect not only them, but also the patient from carrying infection and bacteria, also pests, and ensures a better environment conducive to the patient's recovery. The prince asks, "Is that really so?" because he's never heard that idea before. And he asks, "Does his late teacher's research really contain such a conclusion?" Reina says it does. There are organisms in the water and in the dust that are the root cause of disease, and they may be invisible to the naked eye but very dangerous. The prince asks, "Are these really the same organisms that cause on festering wounds and prevent healing?" Reina replies that they are. The girl is surprised. Damien takes her words seriously, and this time the prince is determined. The prince says that he wants to see how this kind of surgery works, for interest's sake. If it's so effective, as Ren says, then maybe they will standardize the conditions of the surgeries as recommended by Dr. Ren, not only in the palace but in the entire kingdom. Reina is incredibly pleased and thanks His Highness. After all, the prince will be the first to see the uniform once it is ready. The prince will give Ren permission to leave for the capital, and then he can go wherever he wants. The prince trusts that Ren will faithfully follow his teacher's instructions. The girl thanks the prince for such a thing. At that moment, suddenly Vanya enters the prince's room. She heard about the trip to the capital. He says that Vanya has reappeared at just the right time. Vanya replies that it is her talents that he is getting better every year. The princess talks about going to the capital with Ren, and she is sure that mom and dad won't give birth to you if the prince lets her go. The prince asks, since when does Vanya ask his permission? Vanya grabs Ren's hand and says from now on. She starts coaxing her big dear brother. After all, her effeminately beautiful, intelligent, and wonderful brother should let her go. In what sense he is effeminately handsome? At this point, Zared walks into the prince's office. He has a stack of paper and he addresses the prince. Zared says he has more papers for the prince to look at. The prince starts to get angry and asks why his room has turned into a fairground. But Zared asks that the prince not look at him. So after all, he's just doing his job. Since Damien is next in line for the throne, His Majesty Piolisteo has to make sure of the prince's experience, and that includes paperwork. The prince says that his father was always the captain's priority over him, even when Zared was his personal guard. Vanya turns to her brother and asks, "Doesn't Damien remember how he always got Zared into trouble?" After all, it's obvious that Zared would rather listen to his father. Besides, father gives the captain his paycheck, not the prince. Vanya turns to Ren and talks about how Ren didn't know about it, but Masha started out as Damien's nanny, or rather he was his guard. And Ren won't believe it. The antics the captain had to put up with because of her brother. Zared talks about the past, he remembers. One time when they were 13 years old. And one night, the prince invited him to his room and ordered him to run away from the palace with him. Vanya remembers this situation too. After all, her brother had some kind of stomach illness. Well, Vanya teased incessantly that Damien would soon go under Master Faraz's knife. The prince was very afraid of that at the time. And Zared says, so instead of treatment, the prince chose to run away while everyone else slept. Zared was terrified that if he refused, the prince would fire him, but if Zared went with him, he would be punished for helping the prince. Vanya says that her brother was such a tyrant. The prince gets angry and talks about how they can stop discussing this because back then, he was a child. Zared thinks about the fact that the prince is still getting physicals as a child. Vanya says that after that, her brother started reading medical books to avoid misunderstandings in the future and watched his health. Though the princess thinks that her brother just wants to avoid medical checkups and scalpel. Vanya says her brother is a little afraid of them. Damien says he can still hear his sister. Reina thinks that the prince of reading medical books doesn't want to go through the exams, and that's very surprising. After all, there must be another way to get through it. And then Reina can finish, diagnosing the prince. At this point, Vanya puts her arm around the protagonist and turns to her brother. Because as she said earlier, she asks Damien to let her go to the capital with Ren. At this moment, the prince requests that Vanya stay away from men and doctors included. But Vanya replies that the prince is just jealous of her because she will be spending time with Ren, and the prince will not. Reina turns to His Highness and says that if Damien wants to spend time with her, he could just call her to check on his health. Vanya also agrees that the prince should let the doctor examine him. But the prince says that's a definite no. Vanya says that if that's the case, then she has no objection to giving Ren a date. She means in the capital, and they can take the captain with them too. The prince realizes that if Zared accompanies them, then it's okay. He tells them to make sure they try not to get into trouble. Vanya agrees, and she starts to get incredibly excited. Reina thinks about everyone watching this as she creates the love triangle of the century. And Damien is already jealous that she's hanging out with Ren. At this point, the prince calls the doctor and tells him that if he finds out that Ren looked at his sister from the wrong angle, he will kill him. Ren assures His Highness that will not happen. Ren asks if the prince can promise to let him examine the prince as soon as they return. But the prince replies that the doctor should not insist on it. After a while, they are on their way. The prince is watching them from the window. After a while, they are already in the carriage, and Vanya says that she has never been to the capital before. Because of her brother's boredom, it is difficult for her to leave the palace. Zared says that Damien's concern will prove to be unnecessary. However, it is because of his love for his sister. Suddenly, the carriage slowed down and Reina could have fallen on the captain, but Zared held her back. At that moment, Reina apologized, but the captain said it was okay. After a while, they had already arrived at the capital. The captain got out of the carriage first, and he gave his hand to the princess. Following that, he gives his hand to the protagonist. Reina starts to get angry and realizes that men do not give hands to each other. Vanya suggests before finding a tailor to take a walk. Zared says that if they don't mind, he will stop by the store since his younger sister is getting married, and he should find a good wedding gift for her. Vanya says that Zared is gorgeous. After all, any girl or guy would be with him. Zared says that even so, the prince's fleeting bride will be much luckier. Reina asks in surprise, doesn't Damien still have a fiancé? But at that moment, Vanya and Zared start laughing. Vanya says her brother is picky about food and clothes, but not about people. Zared says that of course Damien will have to pick someone up eventually, but at least until the king wants to marry his children. The main character laughs too, since the prince is always so busy and she's not surprised. Vanya talks about how Ren can blame her brother for being such a bachelor. Zared suggests that everyone go into the store already. They are greeted by a saleswoman. She asks how the princess likes their new line of cat jewelry. Vanya talks about how wonderful it is she can't even resist. Reina walks over to one piece of jewelry, talking about how she's not the best jeweler. But this necklace is amazing. Zared approaches the girl and talks about how this necklace would look good on her. Reina says that he hasn't worn any jewelry like that himself, but he can help find something for his sister. They start looking at different items, and Zared says that his sister has always wanted a sapphire brooch. He's sure she'll love it. At that moment, Reina pulls out a bag of gold, and Zared asks if Ren is sure he doesn't want to buy something for himself. But Reina says that the money she has now is not hers. It was given to her by the prince, so she can't do that. Zared asks, "Didn't Damien tell him it was his daily allowance? The royal family has their own account at the store, meaning Reina can buy everything here in Damien's name." Reina doesn't understand. She's really rich. After all, she could use this money to pay off her debt to the medical school. When they leave the store, Vanya says they should head to the tailor. Reina wants to find the best one. After a while, Reina is incredibly upset. She talks about how none of the tailors they went into are suitable. She asks if they can go deeper into the city. Zared says that's a good idea, but he doesn't see where there would be a better place to start. At this point, Vanya thinks about the fact that her brother has never let her go that far before, so she heads off to the dark place. Suddenly, they notice there a homeless man. Reina tries to help him, but at that moment, Zared grabs the girl by the arm and says that this place is not for princesses. Reina just rejoices in her wealth, but the child is sitting here hungry and cold. Reina doesn't even realize how many sick people there are in this world who have no way to heal. The protagonist breaks free from the captain's arms, and she approaches the child. She takes the kid's hand and talks about all she can do for him now. She tells the kid to wait for her. She gives him some gold coins, and they turn around and walk away. Vanya asks how Ren is feeling. Ren replies that he is fine. After a while, they come to a building where the tailor is located. Reina realizes that there is a job for her and she has to do it. They walk into the tailor's and see an incredible store there. Reina sees that this store is modern. At that moment, they are greeted by a girl in her humble store. She says her name is Siti. The girl asks what she can do for her. At this point, Ren says that he would like to know if the girl can sew a particular outfit for him. Siti replies that of course she will try to do so. Reina tries to explain that she is a doctor, so she needs surgical gowns as well as masks and hats. The gowns need to be long-sleeved with ties in the back and the masks. Siti tells the guy not to speak. Not a word more, she will be right back. Vanya starts getting angry and asks, "Did this girl just interrupt the doctor and leave?" At this moment, a dog appears in front of them. Ren didn't think that finding a tailor would be so difficult, but at least her dog is very beautiful. Suddenly, the dog starts crying. Reina asks what's wrong. At that moment, Siti appears and talks about how he has always been emotional. The girl holds out the sketches to the doctor and asks him to take a look. Reina realizes it's perfect. She barely described the design, and these sketches already look ready for modern production. Reina doesn't realize if this woman could have been from her Earth. Siti asks, "Is that what the doctor wanted?" Reina replies that it's amazing. Zared always envisioned it differently. After all, Zared pictured it as knight armor. Reina thinks about how Zared seems to love his job. Ren turns to the tailor and talks about how he needs 5 of these. He asks if the girl could deliver them to the royal palace. Reina asks when they will be ready. Siti replies that it's no problem, but she asks for his measurements first. Siti says not to let the guests be shy and they can look for now. After all, no one knows if the princess might like something. Vanya agrees. She says she would do it with pleasure. Reina is surprised because the clothes look very modern. Reina thinks that if she can somehow travel to this world, then there is a chance that others can too. At that moment, Siti says that she has already finished the fitting. Vanya turns to the doctor and talks about how, honestly, these dresses would fit him perfectly. Ren starts laughing and talks about how he would consider it a compliment, but Zared gets angry and asks what Vanya is saying because Ren is a guy and it wouldn't suit him. Zared suggests the protagonist to wear men's clothes. Vanya starts getting angry and yells at the captain after all men can wear dresses too. Zared asks, Should he really wear a dress then? Vanya replies that perhaps he should. Vanya turns to Madame Lisa, saying that she wants to buy everything. Vanya asks that the girl write it down about the royal family and take it to the palace. Siti speaks of being quite grateful and will send them to the palace, everything including the surgical clothes in 3 weeks. The princess thanks the tailor and talks about how wonderful it would be. As the protagonist is passing by an alley, she sees something in the guy is no longer in that spot, and Reina hopes that the guy was able to buy himself some food and medicine. Suddenly, the protagonist starts calling for the captain. Reina turns around and asks, what was Zared trying to say? But Zared says that he said that foreign traders are coming to the castle soon, they need to hurry back. Vanya tells them that there will be incredible and delicious ingredients from all over the world, and Ren can miss it. Ren replies that they say food is the best medicine. After a while, they head to the market, and Reina talks about how she has never seen anything like it. At that moment, they hear some kind of argument. Reina turns to the princess and asks if her brother is there. At this point, Damien asks the vendor what he just said, but the vendor repeats that he doesn't sell to peasants. After all, if they can't afford it, it's not his problem. Vanya sees that this promises to be interesting. At that moment, a guy stands up for the prince and tells the merchant to watch his language. He asks if the merchant realizes that he is talking to His Highness, but the merchant replies that he's not being disrespectful to His Highness. He just can't stand the insolence of these people. The men begin to apologize. They ask if Sir could sell them a cure for their stomach pains for 2 pieces of silver. After all, his wife is sick, and he can only offer him this based on his income. But the peddler replied that he could not buy even the smallest vial for 2 silver. He told the men to leave. The merchant turns to His Highness and says that the peasants will not be able to afford these medicines anyway, because even the cheapest vials in the church cost 1 gold. He asks if he can look at the vials of medicine he's selling. The merchant replies that the prince can do so. And at that moment, he hands 1 vial of medicine to His Highness. Damien asks, is the peddler saying that this medicine was made by the church? The peddler replies that it is. The prince says that the church's medicines are certainly of the highest quality, so they are priced accordingly. But occasionally there are daredevils who go so far as to create counterfeits and make a profit out of them, taking from the visitors their hard-earned money and not caring at all about their health. The prince says it's a despicable crime, but fortunately, the church has taken special measures to reduce the risk of counterfeit goods tarnishing its reputation. The prince asks if the merchant knows what those measures are. Each bottle is molded with the church's lily of the valley crest. At this point, the prince pulls up a bottle that does not have this crest. The peddler said he must have picked the wrong medicine, and the church ones were left in the warehouse. The peddler says these medicines were made by local herbalists, but they are still of quality, he assures His Highness. The prince asks where the vial of medicine for stomach pain is. The peddler holds out the vial of His Highness's medicine, and the prince tells the peddler to take this silver coin and give the medicine to the man next to him that is with him. The peddler denies it and says it is worth more than 1 coin. At this point, the prince by royal decree reduces the value of this bottle to 1 coin. And according to the Herbalists Association, 1 silver is the net price able to cover all ingredient costs, and it is the price at which a fair profit can be made. The prince asks, does the merchant want to challenge his edict that makes medicine available to all the people of this kingdom? The merchant replies that of course he doesn't want to. He says he was wrong, and holds out the medicine to the people. The people thank His Highness, and this one asks about the doctor. Isn't her take cool? Reina asks, is there really a royal decree that sets a maximum price for medicine? Zared says that Damien monitors the prices of all merchants to make sure that goods are sold at an affordable price. The prince wants to eliminate cheaters and overpricing as much as possible. Reina thinks that this would be useful in her world as well. At this point, Vanya starts calling for her brother. The prince walks up to them. He asks if Ren has found a good tailor in the capital. Ren replies that they did. Vanya asks her brother, wasn't he going to show them everything in this place? Reina sees that the prince is in a good mood right now. Damien replies that he's a little busy right now. At this point, Zared tells Damien not to worry because he thinks they can have fun just by following him. After all, this is the first time Ren is seeing all these foreign merchants, and Zared is sure he'll enjoy it anyway. The prince says he's going to check out the merchants from the west, and apparently they sell plants called chili peppers. Vanya is surprised at such a strange name. She wonders about the sweet Leon. She asks if she can eat 3 whole ones at a time. Reina thinks to herself that she wouldn't want to see that. After a while, they approach, and Reina says for Zared to just look at those fresh peppers. Zared asks, "Hasn't Ren seen them before?" Reina replies that her teacher was given some of these peppers by his foreign friend. Reina hates lying all the time. The seller talks about the buyer having a sharp eye, and it really is a hot chili pepper that gives any dish a new flavor. Asks how it's hot. The salesman says the lovely miss can try it herself, but the pepper is hot enough that 1 tiny bite will be enough. After all, it is very spicy. The girl pops the whole thing in front of her mouth, and Ren tries to stop the girl because he's not sure if she should do that. But after only a moment, the girl realizes how hot the pepper really is, and she feels her tongue burning. At this point, the prince and Damien hold out their swords to the vendor. The prince asks what the vendor fed his sister and how he dared to poison Princess Reina. Turns to his highness, and she assures them it wasn't me. For it is. What the merchant meant by saying it's spicy. It has a burning effect. Vanya turns to her brother and talks about how she felt better. She was just surprised, but in fact, she even liked it. At this point, Prince Damien puts away his swords, and the prince says that Vanya always makes him worry about his sister. Damien apologizes to the merchant for jumping to conclusions. The prince asks if there is anything they can do to make up for the incident. Reina is nice to see someone admit their mistakes, especially when it's done by the prince with the point of maybe Reina was being unfair. The merchant says he doesn't need anything, and he understands his highness's reaction. After all, chili pepper is a novelty in these parts, so they might not know what spicy means. The merchant asks permission to give his highness a gift in honor of receiving foreign traders. The merchant said to let his highness accept his humble gift, and it is crushed cocoa beans. Reina is incredibly surprised because it's chocolate. The merchant presents the prince with a whole sack of it. After a while, they continue walking through the market. Vanya turns to Ren and asks if he's seen this before, because they smell something bitter and earthy. The princess approaches the bear. The prince says that Vanya is embarrassing their staff. Vanya apologizes. She runs up to the protagonist. She asks if Ren knows what these cocoa beans can be used for. Reina replies that she knows a few recipes. Reina tells her that cocoa beans can be used to make many delicious desserts. Vanya talks about how she would really like to try it. After all, it's even possible that her brother would be interested in it, the pickiest man in the kingdom. Damien never finishes his food. He's just like a child. The prince begins to thank his sister, but he asks if she could not complain about him in his presence. Damien talks about how they have a few things to do, so they will see each other later. Meanwhile, Reina is thinking, does the abs never finish their food? She realizes that's not good. After all, picky eating can be caused by a certain disease. Ren turns to the princess and asks how often Damien complains of stomach pains. After all, the prince was passed over about it earlier when we were examined by him. Vanya replies that she has never seen her brother complain, but he usually wrinkles his nose and leaves the food on his plate. In fact, he just doesn't seem to like it. Reina asks if Prince has ever had fever attacks of nausea or vomiting. Reina realizes that Prince also does not have jaundice. Vanya replies that there has been no such thing, and the prince only drinks on special occasions. Reina realizes that there is no sign that the prince has viral or alcoholic hepatitis, but it's for the best. Even if their treatment would be fairly simple, and in both cases they go away on their own, if it's not too advanced, since Damien's experiencing pain after meals. Another reason for this could be acute pancreatitis. However, the pain caused by acute pancreatitis is in the upper left side of the abdomen and radiates to the back. Damien, on the other hand, said he feels pain in the upper right side. But the most common cause of pancreatitis is due to gallstones. If they were on the ground, she could diagnose it by doing an ultrasound and taking a blood test. But since there's no technology here that can easily to confirm her assumption, all she can do now is continue to observe the prince's symptoms and try to make a diagnosis based on her guess, and hope that the prince will trust her more so she can examine him again. Vanya asks, "Is something wrong?" She asks what Reina thinks is the best thing to help her brother increase his appetite. Reina replies that even if Princess's brother has a bad appetite, and we should eat well-balanced food in small portions. And it seems that Reina is the prince's doctor and his nutritionist. Milk is considered a nutritious drink. Plus now they have cocoa beans. After a while, they walk into the palace. Reina says that if today's weather is gloomy and cold, hot chocolate will do just fine. Vanya is already looking forward to it. Reina recalls that she used to love to cook, but mostly she did it out of necessity as she had no one to look after her, and she did everything for herself. But now she has someone to cook for, and it's a stubborn prince. Maybe a hot drink will melt his icy nature. The main character enters the kitchen. The princess wishes everyone good morning, asks what brings Her Highness to this place. They say this place is not for a member of the royal family. They can't have her shoes and dresses stained in soot. Vanya thanks them for their concern, but she says they shouldn't worry because she is fine. Vanya says she is here to introduce them to Mr. Ren because he is the prince's nemesis. Vanya says that they received bags of cocoa beans yesterday, and Ren shows them the recipe for a very tasty dessert called hot chocolate. The maids discuss that it sounds very scary. Vanya starts looking and asking, "Where are the cocoa beans located?" The maid replies that the bags are in the corner, and they wanted to experiment with it themselves. Ren says he has a little experience in making them. To make the chocolate taste better, you have to roast the cocoa beans before grinding them. The maid reaches out her hand to kakababam, but Ren stops her. Ren says that when the maids are cooking, they need to make sure their hands are hygienic. The maid asks what that means. Ren tells her that their hands can easily spread organisms that cause disease and illness. They must wash their hands thoroughly with soap that reduces the risk, that they and the people they serve will get sick from food that is prepared in unhygienic conditions.